He has published a book on Franciscan poets of the 13th century entitled Poets of Divine Love, a monograph on Giuseppe Berto, La Passione della Scrittura, and his most recent publication is the monograph entitled Dante's Prayerful Pilgrimage, Typologies of Prayer in Dance Comedy. He has also written articles on Dante, Boccaccio, Francis of Assisi, Jacopone da Todi, Giuseppe Berto, Diego Fabbri, and Luigi Pirandello. At the moment, his research involves the use of money and poverty in Dante and Franciscan thinkers of the 13th and 14th century. We will talk today about Dante's transgressive approach, church injustice, and divine mercy. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for this introduction. And I would like to echo the colleagues who have preceded me in the conference to thank the organizers and the colleagues who are present, have been present in the last 3 days. It's been a really fascinating group of scholars who got together from many different disciplines, and I have learned an enormous amount. So I'm very, very grateful for fruitful discussions. In particular, I would like to thank Dr. Fabio Ruggirello, who was the director of the Italian Cultural Institute in Tel Aviv until recently, who was actually instrumental in getting me to this conference. So the first couple of things that were mentioned in the presentation, one is the new translation series. If you don't mind, I would like to just spend a couple of words on this. It's a new translation series. It's called Other Voices of Italy, and it's with Rutgers University Press. And so I am one of the 3 editors. And if you have any titles that you would like to propose for a translation from Italian into English, please send them my way, and we'll consider them. The mission of the series is other voices, which means that it's voices that have never been translated into English, were translated into English a long time ago, or have been, for whatever reason, marginalized. So if you have any titles in mind, we'd love to consider them. The other one is Italian Quarterly. I'm the editor of Italian Quarterly. So if you have any articles on any aspect of Italian literature, culture, film, or even history, again, submit them to Italian Quarterly and we'll consider them very happily. So as mentioned, my presentation today is about divine justice and mercy. And the title is indicative of what I'm going to talk about: Dante's transgressive approach, church injustice, and divine mercy. So I'm going to start by saying that anniversary are definitely an opportunity to rethink some authors and to evaluate the scholarship about them. They are also an opportunity to assess the effectiveness of the pedagogy that we adopt to teach these authors to our students. Presenting the Poeta Sacro, whose system of thought is heavily constructed on Christian doctrine and whose poem is all structured upon punishment and reward in the afterlife, can be quite challenging, especially if the student body is as diverse as the one that I have in my classes at Rutgers. New Jersey is one of the most diverse states in the US, and students don't necessarily come equipped with the necessary background about medieval culture, the theology Dante draws from, or even the basic knowledge of the Bible. Introducing Dante with a traditional approach and presenting him as the father of the Italian language, the paladin of the Christian faith, and the patriot of a unified Italy, I think is really no longer realistic, at least for the students in my classes. But also, I would like to say, for a more general public that may be interested in reading the comedy, but is not necessarily equipped with the knowledge of scholars and with the eye of an expert. The key to making Dante more attractive to an audience of young adults can be found in reading his texts with a fresh approach and an eye to originality and creativity. And in the context of this conference, I would like to say also with an eye to the 21st century And to bring up again, one of the issues that was raised during the first day of this conference, I think it was Gur who raised it, about the relationship with the other, Dante in relationship with the other. At a close analysis, Dante's texts reveal a much more transgressive mentality than the one assigned to him by a more traditional approach. Dante shows himself to be a nonconformist mindset, a truly eccentric and rebellious, almost revolutionary character, a dissident personality, an intellect that doesn't conform to the mainstream thinking of his time, a free spirit aimed at confounding those in search for an alignment between text and context. And so a very different image from the Poeta Sacro, the unquestionably religious author, the conventional writer perfectly aligned with widespread attitudes of his time. A very different Dante will emerge if we examine his opinions, for example, on political corruption, on the relationship of truth to falsehood, on the culture of money. Such an analysis will show a dissonant mentality which is constantly opposed to conventional thinking. His approach to love, to money, sexuality, politics, language, or justice offers examples that make Dante relevant to us in the 21st century for the specificity of the themes, but also for his approach to them. I am going to share my screen, and I'm going to share some of the slides that I have here. So today, I will concentrate on Dante's ideas concerning justice, divine justice, and mercy by looking at King Manfred. And King Manfred as Dante portrays him in Purgatorio 3. And I will start with this quotation. Orribil furon le peccati miei, ma la bontà infinita ha sì gran braccia che prende ciò che si rivolge a lei. My sins were ghastly, but the infinite goodness has arms so wide that it accepts whoever would return, imploring it. This tercet of Purgatorio 3 beautifully summarizes Dante's idea of divine mercy in relation to human sin. And in the absence of an absolving church, the captivating image of God's open arms to welcome the repenting sinner sanctions Manfredi's destiny and seals Dante's merciful verdict. Together with Ripheus in Paradiso 20 and Cato the Younger in Purgatorio 2, placing Manfred among the saved despite his repeated, not one, not two, not three, 4 excommunications, shows Dante's defiant attitude towards well-established canonical rules governing salvation and damnation at his time. The historical Manfred was well known in Dante's time, so well known, in fact, that the fictional Manfred candidly asks the pilgrim Dante if he recognizes him, despite the fact that he died in 1266, the year before Dante was born. So famous or infamous were his name and his reputation that he expects everybody to know him. He was particularly notorious within the Guelph circles because he was an enemy of the Pope's political machinations against the empire and against the Sicilian kingdom, which Manfred had inherited from his father. Dante exalts him exactly because he views him as an antagonist of the church's political power, a leader who favors, well, I mean, he favors maybe for his own political and hegemonic interests, but nevertheless, he favors a return of the church to be a spiritual institution instead of the corrupt earthly kingdom that it had become. And that is why he is slaughtered at the Battle of Benevento, and his remains are scattered by the Pope's envoy. Like Dante, he is a victim of the church's political involvement. The way Dante characterizes Manfred reveals the poet's own political views, his rebellious attitude toward established conventions, and his ability and desire to think critically and originally. I will look at 3 elements that can be extrapolated from the 45 lines devoted to him in the canto. And I also want to underline it's only 45 lines, and this speaks to Dante's ability to be incredibly synthetic. In 45 lines, he basically concentrates his ideas on Manfred and his ideas on justice and mercy. So I'll speak about 3 different elements extrapolated from these lines. One is Manfred's genealogy, Manfred's request for prayers from the living, and finally, the Battle of Benevento. So number 1, Manfred's genealogy. Although it was well known that Manfred was the illegitimate son of Emperor Frederick II and of Bianca Lancia, and although it was also well known that Frederick legitimized him on his mother's deathbed when he married her, Dante chooses to have Manfred identify himself through his female genealogy, when Manfred says, "Io son Manfredi, nepote di Costanza imperatrice." I am Manfred, the grandson of Empress Constance. And 2 lines below, 2 lines later, he says, "Mia bella figlia genitrice dell'onor di Sicilia ed Aragona." My lovely daughter, mother of kings of Sicily and Aragon. Manfred's paternal grandmother, Constance, enjoys the bliss of salvation and blessedness in the heaven of the moon in Paradiso 3, in one of what are known as the vertical episodes, right? We have Manfred in Purgatorio 3 and Constance in Paradiso 3. Because Dante views Constance too, as a victim of ecclesiastical cruelty when she was abducted from the monastery and forced to marry Henry VI and produce an heir, the future king, emperor, Frederick II. Dante spurns the vitriolic rumors about her alliance with the devil that would have delivered the Antichrist Frederick, and believes instead in an innocent woman who became the victim of a political ploy. The other Constance, Manfred's daughter, is also evoked in all her regal splendor and maternal influence as the mother of 2 kings, the King of Sicily and the King of Aragon. Manfred relies on the help of these 2 women as solid pillars of spiritual guidance, models of human loyalty and religious devotion, who are far removed from the male counterpart of the family, but also from the all-male ecclesiastical hierarchy that uses religion as an instrument of political repression. It is on the 2 Costanzas that Manfred entrusts the advancement of his soul toward total purification and beatitude, much like Dante himself, who entrusts his salus, his salvation, to women like Mary and Lucy and Beatrice and Matilda. Number 2, request for prayers. The second point that I want to make is strongly linked to the female genealogy and concerns Manfred's request that Dante become the vehicle to spread the news of his salvation on earth. Since he died while still an excommunicate, people may think that he's damned in hell. So he has to rectify that. And he says, "On Dio ti priego che quando tu riedi vadi a mia bella figlia genitrice dell'onor di Sicilia ed Aragona e dichi il vero a lei, s'altro si dice. I pray that when you reach the world again, you may go to my lovely daughter, mother of kings of Sicily and Aragon, tell her the truth, lest she's heard something other." After this introductory invocation, at the end of his account, Manfred reveals that the penalty the excommunicates must suffer is to wait 30 years for every year of their excommunication, as the key line proclaims, "Se tal decreto più corto per buon prieghi non diventa," unless that edict is abridged through fitting prayers. Before Manfred then repeats his plea to his daughter Constance. Vedi oggimai se tu mi puoi far lieto, revelando alla mia buona costanza come mai visto, e anco esto divieto, che qui per quei di là molto s'avanza. Now see if you, by making known to my kind constance where you saw my soul and why delays decreed for me, can make me happy. Those here, through those beyond, advance more quickly. Those here, through those beyond, advance more quickly. This sentence summarizes the theology of intercessory prayer or prayer of suffrage in the whole poem. Manfred surrounds his speech with these two requests for prayers that bookend the narrative of his death in battle. He is the first of the purging souls to make this request, and he therefore sets the tone for a strong connection between the living and the dead in prayer. He establishes a pattern of the soul's request to Dante to bring back to earth the reality of their destiny as saved souls, and a plead for more prayers from the living, from their living family and friends, so that their purification journey may be shortened and expedited. After Manfred, many other souls will take advantage of the pilgrim Dante, who is a unique messenger who will travel back to earth in order to make their condition in the afterworld known to the living. But above all, they express a meta-prayerful request through him to family and friends that they pray for them and advance their journey toward total purification and blessedness. Intercessional prayer shows the strong ties between purgatory and earth, spiritual world and physical world, heaven and earth, the living and the dead, a theological principle that, as Jacques Le Goff has highlighted in his book, The Rise of Purgatory, La naissance du purgatoire, was still developing in Dante's time, and to which Dante, according to Le Goff, definitely contributed with his writing. During the pilgrim's ascent, I have counted 18 souls that request prayers from the living. And here they are listed right here. But I have only counted 3 souls who make the specific request to bring to earth the news of their salvation, probably because they themselves had doubted of their own salvation. These souls are Manfred, Bonconte da Montefeltro, and Pia dei Tolomei. This multiple relaying of messages between purgatorial petitioners, Dante the messenger, and earthly supplicants is summarized in Dante's text itself when Dante Poet in Purgatorio 6, line 26, I'm sorry, that's wrong, line 26, it's not 6, 6:26, calls the souls quell'ombre che pregar pur ch'altri prieghi, those shades who always pray for others' prayers for them. Number 3, the Battle of Benevento. In his account of the Battle of Benevento, Manfred takes for granted that Dante knows exactly what happened and what was at stake in the fight between the empire and Charles d'Anjou. Since in the year 1300, the battle, which was fought on February 26, 1266, was still part of the European collective memory, a crucial historical event that determined the Ghibellines' loss of power and the final defeat of the Hohenstaufen rule in southern Italy. That is why Manfred disregards the battle itself and focuses his narrative on himself and particularly on his death, which was still, and I should say in part still is, shrouded in mystery. His account offers Dante's perspective on this important political and historical event, which exonerates Manfred from any wrongdoing thanks to his confession and repentance at the time of his death, but incriminates instead the Pope and the Archbishop of Cosenza, more than even accusing the French troops, who, yes, killed Manfred legitimately in combat though, and buried him under a pile of rocks. The sacrilegious act of unearthing his bones and throwing them on the other side of the river Verde is ascribed to the Cardinal Bartolomeo Pignatelli, at the time the Archbishop of Cosenza, who follows Pope Clement IV's orders and goes, as Dante says, alla caccia, hunting him, as if he was a wild animal to be captured, dead or alive. Once his men found Manfred's bones, sotto la guardia della grave mora, under a heap of heavy stones, they disinterred them and threw them outside the Papal States and also outside the kingdom, that same kingdom that Manfred had claimed as his own. The church deprived Manfred of the dignity and the consolation of even a burial site, which is granted even to the worst enemies. The two historians that report details about Manfred's death and burial are Giovanni Villani and Ricordano Malispini, who may have been Dante's sources, but paradoxically, they may have been actually using Dante's text as their own source. So facts remain quite murky. The real protagonist of this episode, I would claim, is excommunication, the great punishment for any religious transgressions in the Jewish Christian tradition, which starts out as a spiritual and doctrinal disciplinary measure, but throughout the Middle Ages is turned into a political tool to control the church's enemies. And it is specifically this particular mingling of religious and political realms that Dante condemns. Excommunication, as we know, is an act of exclusion from the community of the faithful. And the gravity of such exclusion was sealed by a liturgical ritual that was known as the ritual of the bell, the book, and the candle. The bell, the book, and the candle. During this ritual, the ringing of a bell, the closing of the Bible, and the blowing off of a candle was meant to sanction symbolically the death of the excommunicate to the congregation of the faithful. This ritual is parallel to the exclusion of exiles from their own hometowns, when their names were registered in the Book of the Dead to confirm their total and unappealable removal from the community. The affinity of Manfred's destiny as an excommunicate with Dante's destiny as an exile is quite clear in Purgatorio 3, and it is confirmed by this cultural element of the liturgical and civic rituals of exclusion. Excommunication does not necessarily equal expulsion from the church. It is a suspension or temporary exclusion from participation in important liturgical functions and from sacraments. The removal can be revoked and the faithful can be readmitted into the community. It is not likewise synonymous with damnation in hell unless it is accompanied by anathema, the biblical curse. Now, one of the 4 excommunications that Manfredi endured, the one that he received on April 10th, 1259, also carried anathema, and therefore his damnation was considered by many a reality. Interestingly, it was signed by Pope Innocent, this particular excommunication that carried anathema was signed by Pope Innocent IV, the same Pope who, at the First Council of Lyon in 1245, reconfirms the doctrine of excommunication in the Church. Those representatives of the Church who were supposed to be his advocates have now turned into his enemies. So Manfred goes directly to the source of forgiveness without any intermediaries. Io mi rendei piangendo a quel che volentier perdona. In tears, I then consigned myself to him who willingly forgives. Manfred also explains how excommunicates like him can be saved when he says, per lor maledizion si non si perde, che non possa tornar l'eterno amore, mentre che la speranza a fior del verde. Despite the church's curse, there is no one so lost that the eternal love cannot return, as long as hope shows something green. In this enlarged perspective that postulates a theological principle in this last tertina, the reader can perceive the poet's opinion and the poet's voice when formulating this clear opposition between the church's curse and God's eternal love. In the poetic context of his narrative, such exclusion acquires very corporeal connotations when it is made clear that the church continues to pursue Manfred's excommunication even after his death by desecrating his remains. Such is the textual emphasis on his body that Dante even describes Manfred's beauty. Biondo era e bello e di gentile aspetto. He was fair-haired and handsome, and his aspect was noble. This insistence on aesthetic details, corporeal details, is quite unique. Is a unique occurrence of bodily descriptions in the whole poem. If we think about it, Dante doesn't even offer details about Beatrice's looks, for example. But it is above all a description of his wounds that raises the symbolism of the scene when Manfred shows the pilgrim the cut on his eyebrow. Ma l'un de cigli un colpo avea diviso. But one eyebrow had been cleft by a sword stroke. And then he calls his attention to the open wound on his chest, an open wound on his chest. Or vedi e mostrommi una piaga assommo il petto. Look now, showing me a wound high on his chest. The cleft eyebrow and the split chest are metaphors for the rupture caused in his life by excommunication, but they also turn Manfred into a martyr of the faith, since martyrs whose bodies had been disfigured by torture and violent death, according to St. Augustine, keep the signs of the martyrdom even after their death in their glorious bodies. As in the Martyrology, the catalogue narrating their merits and witness of saintly martyrs, Dante's entire narrative is focused on Manfred's testimony and death, while his life's accomplishments as a politician, as an intellectual, as a linguist, as a philosopher, and as a poet are not even mentioned. It is his martyrdom at the end of his life that determined his political and moral legacy in Dante's view. Death was a subject of reflection for Manfred himself, the historical Manfred himself, when he translated from Hebrew to Latin the Liber de Pomo sive di morte Aristotelis, which is an anonymous treatise on death wrongly attributed to Aristotle, which circulated widely first in Arabic from the 9th century, and then also in Hebrew. In his introduction to the De Pomo, Manfred meditates exactly as he does in Dante's rendition of this character in Purgatorio 3, on his sins and on the divine mercy. And he writes that we did not regret, and here you have the Latin on the left and my English translation on the right, so it's kind of loose because I was trying to render a more comprehensible, understandable version in English. We did not regret abandoning this life, says Manfred, but in order to earn the reward of perfection of eternal life, we confided not in justice, but instead in the Creator's mercy.
Alessandro, you have 2 minutes.
Yeah, I'm done. I have one paragraph. Thank you. So maybe this sentence, we confided not in justice, but instead in the Creator's mercy. This sentence contains a summary of Manfred's ethics and of his faith, but also a mysterious announcement of his glorious death at the hands of the papal allies. His entire fictional character is a testimony to Dante's transgressive thinking about an irreconcilable opposition between the church's straying from the path of spiritual leadership to become implicated in political maneuvers on one side, and God's accepting attitude on the other. It is this freedom of thought that condemns hypocrisy and opportunism while exacting rectitude and honesty, even when it may lead to sacrificial death, that may make Dante more attractive to 21st century readers, especially to young readers like our students. And I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Yes. So Yoav Rinon teaches at the Department of Comparative Literature and the Department of Classics at the Hebrew University. Among these publications is a verse translation to Hebrew of Dante's Inferno and a commentary also in Hebrew on the Inferno, which he wrote with Luisa Ferretti Cuomo. He will talk about grace and luck from Dante via Petrarch to Machiavelli.
So thank you very much, Yona, for this presentation. And I would like to thank all the former speakers, both yesterday and the day before yesterday, for the intriguing and very interesting talks. The aim of my talk today is to present a certain trajectory in Italian literature from Dante via Petrarch up to Machiavelli, which revolves around the problematics, or more precisely, around the tension between predestination and free will. My general claim is that the differences between the three writers under discussion, as revealed by inspecting them through this prism, can enhance our understanding not only of each of the three Weltanschauung, but also, and no less important, of the way Italian literature reflects a deep change in the conception of the human condition. Moreover, I postulate that the conspicuous differences between the three are essentially on a somewhat superficial level, while on a deeper level, it is the similarity that can be recognized. To put it somewhat differently, while the movement from Dante to Petrarch, and then from Petrarch to Machiavelli, is a movement from a theocentric to an anthropocentric world, it is, at the same time, a movement within the same orbit where, and here is my focal point, the main characteristics is not a difference between the presence of a divine Archimedean point in a religious world on the one hand, and its absence in a secular one on the other hand, but rather a similarity between two absences of precisely such an Archimedean point which can imbue the world with meaning. It is not difficult to fathom how Machiavelli fits into this scheme. Petrarch, who somewhat hovers between the deeply religious world of Dante and the absolute secular world of Machiavelli, can, albeit with some difficulty, belong to this conception. Dante, in contrast, seems absolutely alien to this worldview. However, as my reading of Dante aims to show, it is already in his Commedia that the tension between the two poles, namely of free will and of predestination, is not resolved, let alone solved, but rather, like a Gordian knot, abruptly dissolved. One more comment before I move to Dante's text in order to illuminate this feature in his divine work. Since this is a Dante conference, and since my time is limited, I will expand mostly on him and refer less to Petrarch and much less to Machiavelli. Dante's Commedia, at least at first sight, seems to chart a narrative of redemption. The essence of the pilgrimage, which the Commedia relates and the poet protagonist realizes along its 100 cantos, lies in the notion of movement as a representation of a process of redemption. True, the pilgrim's progress occurs along a spatial and a temporal axis, yet this progress is, first and foremost, a spiritual one, referring to a journey which leads Dante from the realm of sin, through the realm of remorse, up to the highest echelon of the divine kingdom of the blessed. This movement is absolutely necessary for the pilgrim's redemption, and it must be realized in its entirety. We should recall, however, that Dante's instigation to move on in the dark wood was his own aspiration to reach the beautiful things which he discerned at the top of a mountain afar, and that it was precisely this attempt which was not only blatantly thwarted by the three beasts, but also put the pilgrim himself in mortal danger. The reason for this, as Virgil is soon to divulge, is not that the aspiration in itself is bad and reprehensible. Quite the contrary, Dante's wish to reach the beautiful things at what will later be revealed as Mount Purgatory is both good and honorable. Moreover, the pilgrimage will lead him precisely to this place and even further. What is absolutely forbidden is therefore neither the goal nor the movement towards it. No, what is categorically prohibited is the trial to make a shortcut, to get straight to the top of the mountain without going first through the realm of sin. Recall also that this was precisely the transgression of Odysseus, Dante's alter ego, who navigated his ship straight towards the alluring lights of Mount Purgatory, a sin for which he, Odysseus, is condemned to eternal hell. The fact that Dante did not know, and actually could not know, that his wish and consequent act, which, to recapitulate, are not only essentially good, but also leading to the best possible happiness ever, are, in fact, thoroughly transgressive. The fact that, moreover, his ignorance is embedded in his being human, that is to say, in his natural limitedness as regards knowledge, this fact is utterly irrelevant either to the categorizing of the act as sinful or, worse still, to the unavoidable and irrevocable horrendous punishment it entails. This theological conception, according to which a transgression of a divine limit is punished merely according to the severity of the transgression and absolutely regardless of the cognizance or ignorance of the doer as regards the sinful nature of his or her act, this conception then is essentially pagan. Sophocles' Philoctetes formulates this theological wisdom through its eponymous protagonist, who unknowingly transgresses the limit of an unmarked sacred ground, and then, as a punishment, is bitten by the snake which guard the precinct. The suffering due to the wound is monstrous, and it lasts for 9 whole years, during which Philoctetes is left, alone and half dead, to rot on a deserted island. Both Philoctetes' sin and his punishment are deeply embedded in the Greek notion of responsibility, which occasionally, although not always, concentrate on the act itself while ignoring its circumstances. Dante, of course, consciously aspired to present an anti-pagan conception of both sin and responsibility, a presentation so conspicuously realized by his decision to substitute himself for Virgil as the poeta profeta of the new era which he, Dante, harbingers. According to this Christian notion, sin is inalienable from conscious choice, which in its turn implies free will. Doing is therefore an outcome of who you are, that is to say, of being, rather than an inevitable outcome of powers over which one has no control. Thus, in complete contrast with the Virgilian Aeneas, whose acts are predestined by fatum, Dante, in both his roles, as pilgrim and poet alike, is the embodiment of the willing and consequently of the choosing person. Like Hercules, who finds himself at a crossroads where virtue and vice diverge, so does Dante, the Christian, find himself on the verge of sin while perceiving the bristling sparks of virtue on the horizon where Mount Purgatory is located. Even more important, Dante chooses. He chooses, he fears nevertheless, to go down to hell with Virgil, and he chooses, at a much later stage, to continue his journey up until the end where he can see God. Or, at least, this is the story that Dante wishes us to believe as truth. For the same Commedia, from which the above story is constructed, also tells another and a rather different story, according to which the pilgrimage is preceded, in fact, conditioned by powers over which Dante has no influence, let alone control. If it had been merely up to Dante, he would have continued in trying to confront the evil power of the she-wolf, a trial which would have led him to death. The fact that his efforts were instigated by the desire to the ultimate good presented by Mount Purgatory would have been to no avail. In fact, it was precisely this desire that led him to the dangerous path in the first place. What is more, as we hear in the second canto, the journey through hell, a sine qua non for his redemption, filled him with so much fear and trembling that he considered giving it up altogether. The decisive factor was neither his genuine proclivity to virtue, nor his choice to realize this proclivity. The decisive factor, the one which literally enabled him to choose, was nothing less than divine intervention. And this intervention affects both him and his decision, not once, but twice. Virgil's appearance, as we learn only in the second canto, was an outcome of Beatrice's intervention. But Virgil's intervention alone was not enough for convincing Dante to go through the dangerous journey. Although the first canto terminates with Dante following his master, the second canto opens with fear, or with cowardice, if we take Virgil's words, which in its turn arouses in Dante the wish to relinquish the pilgrimage altogether. It is only when Virgil describes to Dante both Beatrice's appearance to him and her, Beatrice's narrative about the noble lady, probably the Virgin Mary, and Lucia's intervention for him, from Dante, that the latter is finally convinced to continue the journey. This holy feminine trinity is nothing less than the allegory of Caritas, the divine grace, which is responsible for Dante's rescue as well as for his redemption. It is therefore grace which forms the theological, the literary, and the literal contexts of the journey to redemption. And it is in the context of grace that we should interpret the appearance and location of Fortuna in the Commedia, the self-same Fortuna which links Dante with Petrarch and then Petrarch with Machiavelli. Fortuna appears in the seventh canto of the Commedia, and it is there that Virgil explains to Dante that Fortuna is, in fact, in the service of divine justice. In contrast with classical, post-classical, and even in contrast with former notions of Fortuna formulated by Dante himself, where Fortuna is presented as a blind, hostile, and uncontrollable force, here, in the midst of hell, she is integrated into the divine and just Christian scheme. If she seems to us as the realization of malicious arbitrariness, this is only due to our human ignorance and limitedness. For in fact, she is quite the opposite. When we move to Petrarch, a somewhat different world vision is revealed to us. Petrarch, of course, is a Christian writer, and his poetry is suffused with Christian motifs and symbols. And yet, a stark difference can be discerned between him and Dante regarding the nature and consequently the essence of the conception of Christianity. To be succinct, for Dante, poetry is in the service of Christianity, while for Petrarch, Christianity is the service of poetry. Stylistically speaking, this abysmal difference finds its expression through the gulf between allegory in Dante and metaphor in Petrarch. That the two tropes are strongly connected, allegory, after all, is an extended metaphor, does not curtail the difference, but on the contrary, sustains it even more. For it is precisely this difference of extension between the two which reflects the change of essence. Allegory encompasses all, metaphor only a part. Which means that while Dante's world, both the poetical and the literal, is completely overruled by Christianity, Petrarch's poetical and literal world, however suffused with Christianity, is only partially ruled by it. Take, for example, martyrdom. In Petrarch, it turns from a Christian reality into a poetical device depicting not the pilgrim's progress, but the lover's progress. Or take, for another example, Petrarch's use of the notion of the donna, which is almost always much more about Laura than about the Virgin, or his incessant reference to death as the final and absolute end. It is therefore far from surprising that in Petrarch Canzoniere, and I consciously ignore the philosophical treatise De Remediis Utriusque Fortunae, here Fortuna acquires once more her former pagan characteristics of blind, cruel, and unjust fate. And when this happens, then the fundaments of the whole Weltanschauung are shaken. For while Dante's poetry transcends human love and, even more important, human passion in order to reach God, with the help of Beatrice, Petrarch utilizes human love and human passion in order to reach poetry, with the help of Laura. The same means the transcended lady serves for essentially different transcendental ends, God versus art. I am now moving, and very briefly, to the last writer in my talk, Machiavelli. Fortuna, in his discussion of becoming a prince of a new state, that is to say, of becoming a prince not because one was an heir, but due to oneself. Machiavelli differentiates between those who become princes either due to fortuna or because of their virtue. Interestingly, even those who turn into princes due to their virtue are also in need of fortuna. For it is the latter who endow them with kairos, with the perfect timing for the new identity, a component without which they could not realize their virtuous qualities as statesmen. More important for our discussion is the next chapter of The Prince, where Machiavelli refers to the career of Cesare Borgia. The latter, Machiavelli claims, lost his state due to an extreme maliciousness of fortuna, and this despite the fact that his conduct from a political, not from a moral point of view, was impeccable. To conclude, although in the question of free will and predestination, Dante gives a very different impression than the one we have from Petrarch and obviously from Machiavelli, he is, in fact, much closer to them than it seems at first sight. The Dantescan superposition of divine grace over both free will and predestination almost annuls the question, creating a world not very different from that of Augustine, whose worldview, which revolves around the notion of indelible original sin, basically precludes any possibility of free will and therefore of free choice. Petrarch, as a harbinger of the early Renaissance, already distances himself de facto, although not de jure, from Dante's conception of Christianity, and his poetry starts formulating a new version of humanity in which theology becomes more and more marginalized and art is gradually substituting for it. In this context, Fortuna, which was absolutely subdued to divine justice in Dante's world, becomes more and more independent and therefore both more and more effective as well as less and less just. In Machiavelli, the process reaches its termination, and Fortuna, as a blind, unpredictable, and rather a cruel force, dominates human affairs and dictates ungraciously their fortunes.
Thank you, Yoav. So I introduce now our last speaker of this session. Gur Zak teaches at the Department of General and Comparative Literature and the Department of Human Studies at the HUJI University of Zurich. He is the author of Petrarch's Humanism and the Care of the Self, and next year will appear his new book, Boccaccio and the Consolation of Literature. Forthcoming in 2022 are also 2 volumes he edited, a collection of Hebrew translations from Petrarch's Latin works, which he co-translated with Aminadab Dickman, Avraham Aroueti, and Nathan Ron, and the volume Textual Communities, Textual Selves, Essays in Dialogue with Brian Stock, co-edited with Sarah Corey. His current research project deals with the implications of confession in Italian Renaissance literature. The topic of his speech now is about common grounds, compassion, and community in Dante and contemporary thought. Thank you.
Thank you. I got so used to being in my room in this conference and in my computer, and now this hybrid format is making a mess of everything. When we drafted our proposal for this conference, one of the themes we wanted to focus on was what we call Dante, a global contemporary. The idea was to offer reflections on Dante's continuing relevance to contemporary anxieties and concerns. Many presentations in our conference have already addressed this issue in stimulating ways. And in my presentation today, I would like to further touch upon it by constructing a dialogue between Dante's Commedia and contemporary thought on a topic which is, I believe, of central importance to both, the relationship between compassion and community. Exploring this dialogue, as I hope, will not only underscore Dante's continuing relevance to our own day and age, but will also provide us with some, hopefully, new insights on the Commedia. The question of the political value of compassion has been at the center of interest of several disciplines in recent years. The most influential voice in this inquiry is probably that of Martha Nussbaum, who in numerous studies makes a strong case for compassion as what she calls the basic social emotion. For Nussbaum, compassion is an emotion, sorrow for the pain of another, which rests on the cognitive realization that humans are imperfect creatures vulnerable to powers beyond their control. Having compassion for the less fortunate and seeking to provide them with basic assistance is, or rather should be, according to her, the foundation of the political community, on the individual as well as the institutional level. Nussbaum, however, is far from alone in this valorization of compassion. Proponents of the feminist ethics of care, such as Nell Goddings or Lawrence Bloom, as well as post-structuralist critics such as Judith Butler, share in many respects, and despite obvious differences, Nussbaum's position, and see in the notions of care and compassion a crucial alternative to current neoliberal ideology. While liberal and neoliberal views posit the autonomous and individualistic self as the normative ideal, and sees the task of the political community as securing individual freedom above all else, care ethicists emphasize the inescapably dependent and relational nature of the self and place moral value in mutual care based on compassion. As the philosopher Lawrence Bloom argues, traditional liberal morality, with its emphasis on universal mores of justice and duty, does not account for, and I quote, you have it also here on the screen, those virtues of mature persons of which responsiveness is a developmental precursor. These are the virtues of care, compassion, concern, kindness. So with these considerations in mind, I would like to turn to Dante's Purgatorio and explore the relationship between compassion and community in it. Concentrating on Canto 13 of the Purgatorio, perhaps Dante's most elaborate engagement with compassion in the Commedia, I would like to show how Dante establishes compassion as an important cornerstone of his ideal community. Furthermore, I wish to show how his reliance on compassion partakes in a general tendency in early 14th century Florence of utilizing theological virtues to secular civic ends, a fact which turns the Commedia into an important genealogical antecedent of the current views mentioned above. While much of recent Dante's poetry
as Justin Steinberg contended recently, considered Dante as a precursor to modern liberal notions of individual freedom, the following analysis will argue that his engagement with compassion makes him rather an important precursor and a valuable pre-modern champion of contemporary notions of care. Scholarly discussions of the Commedia have, of course, touched upon Dante's preoccupation with the nature of community. Elisa Brilli has offered recently a wide-ranging analysis of Dante's concept of civitas in his various works and pointed to the important role of the theological virtue of charity in his vision of the ideal community. Other scholars, such as Giuseppe Mazzotta and Claire Honnes, have pointed specifically to the Purgatorio as the cantica which embodies Dante's vision of the ideal community, a vision that has specific earthly implications. For Honnes, it is in the Purgatorio that Dante lays out his ideal of perfect citizenship, which is based at heart on moral uprightness. What is missing from this account, I want to suggest, is a recognition of the importance of compassion, understood in specifically Thomistic terms as that which undergirds the Dantean ideal community. Dante's exploration of the communal value of compassion in Purgatorio 13 comes to light through its contrast with the central scene punished in the canto, that of envy or invidia. In the beginning of the canto, Dante and Virgilio arrived at the second terrace of the mountain in which invidia is being purged. The Latin etymology of invidia associates it closely with the sense of sight, invidere, literally to look in or to look too closely. Envy thus stands for casting a twisted or sorrowful glance on the good fortune of another, a notion that is captured in the wonderful Hebrew phrase tzarut ayin, casting an arrow eye. In the canto, Dante closely builds upon this visive etymology as the description of the terrace of envy is replete with allusions to sight. Most tellingly, this is evident in the rather gruesome contrapasso that the envious soul suffers in the canto. Their eyelids, as we learn, are sewn up by iron wires in a manner that causes a particularly painful kind of blindness. While lingering on the visive dimensions of the sin of envy, Dante's description also gives particular attention to the way envy undermines the very fabric of the community. This link between envy and communal strife is a recurring feature throughout the Commedia, as invidia is often portrayed as responsible for the factionalism plaguing Dante's Florence, the quintessential example of the fractured community in the work. Already in the first mention of Florence in the Commedia, the glutton Chaco attributes its internal strife to invidia. And I quote here briefly, you have the quotation on the slide. La tua città che è piena di invidia, sì che già trabocca il sacco. Envy, as this metaphorical line suggests, is associated with the gluttonous desire for wealth and power that tears the city apart. In Purgatorio 13, the communal dimensions of envy emerge especially in Dante's encounter in the second half of the canto with the Sienese noblewoman Sapia. When described her scene, Sapia lingers on the way her envious disposition led her to pray for a fellow citizen's defeat in battle and then to be filled with ecstatic joy when they were indeed vanquished. Establishing envy as a central civic vice, Dante, I would argue, presents compassion in Purgatorio 13 as one of its main counterparts. In each of the 7 terraces of scene in the Purgatorio, as we know, Dante introduces a virtue that contrasts with the main scene presented in the terrace. The virtue countering invidia in Purgatorio 13 is identified by Virgilio in line 39 with amor, love. Yet, as Barolini pointed out, this identification is not entirely clear, as love is described by the same Virgilio in Canto 17 as the form underlying all the virtues. A much clearer counterpart to envy within the canto, I would suggest, is that of misericordia or compassione, which is often considered, for example, in the Summa of Aquinas, as a subtype of love, of caritas. It is in Purgatorio 13, we should remember, that the word compassion appears in the Commedia for the first and only time. Dante, of course, usually uses the related term pietà to describe the emotional commotion. Etymologically, compassion comes from the Latin cum patior, which signifies suffering with, sharing in suffering. In the Summa Theologia, Aquinas uses the word compassio when defining the virtue of misericordia. And we'll read it here. You have it, the Latin and then the translation. I will just read the translation. Misericordia is heartfelt sympathy for another's distress, impelling us to succor him if we can. Compassio, which when Aquinas says misericordia is heartfelt sympathy is the compassio in his definition. Misericordia est aliena miseria in nostro corde compassio. So compassio is essentially synonymous in the definition with misericordia, both indicating a sorrow for the distress of another. Now, within the same discussion, Aquinas also presents misericordia as the direct opposite of envy. As he explains, while the envious person grieves over the good fortune of the other, the compassionate one sorrows for the other's misfortune. And let's read the translation. For envy is directly contrary to compassion, their principal objects being contrary to one another, since the envious man grieves over his neighbor's good, whereas the pitiful man grieves over his neighbor's evil. Now, this Thomistic opposition between envy and compassion is closely reflected in Purgatorio 13. The context in which the word compassion appears in the canto is the pilgrim's beholding of the sight of the group of blind sinners, a sight which elicits an intense affective response from him. And let's read the original. You can follow the translation if you want. Non credo che per terra vada ancoi homo sì duro che non fosse punto per compassion di quel che io vidi poi, che quando fui sì presso di lor giunto, che gli atti loro a men venivan certi, per gli occhi foi di gravi dolor munto. In what is likely the pilgrim's most intense, compassionate reaction within the Purgatory, the passage stresses how it is specifically the sight of suffering that generates compassion in him. A notion he then further stresses when he declares that sight has the particular power to cause distress, per la vista che non meno agonia. This emphasis on the link between eyesight and compassion connects us to the scene of invidia, central to the canto, and underscores the contrast established between them. Just as it is a twisted gaze that generates invidia, so sight can be a source of benevolence. The image that generates the pilgrim's intense compassion is one which entails in itself a strong gesture of compassion, as it focuses on the way the group of blind sinners offers support to one another. And I read the passage, di vil cilicio mi parean coperti, e l'un sofferri all'altro con la spalla, e tutti dalla ripa erano sofferti. As this line indicates, the blind sinners sit close to one another and rely on each other's shoulders for support. L'un sofferri all'altro. The message is clear. Those who in life tore apart the community through their envy now have to support one another in their suffering. Only a few terzine later, in line 7981, the poet takes care to describe that Mount Purgatory is highly steep, and that to the right of the narrow path wherein Virgilio now stands, there is a menacing abyss with no barrier to protect them. This detail possibly alerts our attention to the fact that the group of blind souls also must support one another when they walk up the mountain, so it's or the terrace. So it's basically not to fall to this abyss. Mutual aid and support is essential for survival. No less than the pain they suffer, it is therefore the communal experience that serves as a means of education and purgation for the sinners, and this is essentially an education in compassion. This extensive focus on compassion in Purgatorio 13 is further apparent in the extra sensitivity the pilgrim shows towards the situation of the punished souls. In contemporary terms, we might say that the pilgrim exhibits special empathy in this canto, in the sense of placing himself in the position of the other and imagining what they are feeling. After describing the sinner's sewn-up eyes, the poet pilgrim states, "A me pareva andando fare oltraggio, veggendo altrui non essendo veduto." So considering the situation from the perspective of the sinners, Dante feels that he is making an oltraggio, an affront, by seeing and not being seen, a benevolent sensitivity that again contrasts with the envious gaze. The chiastic structure of line 74, veggendo altrui non essendo veduto, underscores this exercise in empathy as it highlights the poet pilgrim's shift between his active, veggendo, and passive, essendo veduto, position vis-a-vis the other. His discomfort leads him to address the group and reveal his presence, becoming thus temporarily part of their community. While elaborating in this manner on the communal value of compassion, Purgatorio 13 also underscores the virtuous and just nature of this emotion, and this possibly as a response to the problematic dimension of compassion that emerged in the Inferno. The scene depicting the pilgrim's intense emotional response to the sight of the envious souls, of course, recalls various scenes in the Inferno in which he had shown similar compassion. It particularly resembles the scene in Inferno 20, in which the sight of the deformed bodies of the diviners elicit tears of pity from him. In the Inferno, as we know, such expressions of pietà involve inevitable tensions as they conflict with the dictates of justice, of divine justice, which seal the sinful soul's fate for eternity. It is in Inferno 20 that Virgilio directly rebukes the pilgrim for his unwarranted compassion. Ancor sei tu degli altri sciocchi, qui vive la pietà quando ben morta. In Purgatorio 13, however, Dante highlights how the emotional commotion of compassion does not contradict justice, but is rather essential for its promotion. The souls in Purgatorio, in contrast to those in Inferno, and much like those on earth, are still in process. Their ultimate fate is still in waiting, and hence showing them compassion and performing acts on their behalf as the capacity to alleviate their distress and thus advance justice. In his discussion of Misericordia in the Summa, Aquinas asserts that it is precisely this capacity to motivate action that turns compassion into a virtue. He mentions specifically the instances in which iste motus animi, this movement of the mind, leads us either to give to the needy or to forgive the repentant. This virtuous and just dimension of compassion is stressed in Purgatorio 13, especially through the example of the simple comb seller, Pier Pettinaio, mentioned by Sapia in her speech. Though unrelated to Sapia in any way, as she tells us, he took pity on her and prayed on her behalf, thus reducing the length of her punishment in Purgatorio. Once again, the compassion of Pettinaio is strategically contrasted with the envy of Sapia in a manner that underscores the virtuous and just nature of the former. Purgatorio 13, therefore, offers a penetrating portrayal of the dichotomy between compassion and envy, and powerfully underscores the necessity of the former for the good of the community. In positing a virtue with strong religious undertones as the foundation of the political community, Dante was following a trend that was emerging in Florence in the late 13th and early 14th century among near predecessors, such as his teacher Brunetto Latini and the Dominican preacher Remigio de Girolami, who preached at Santa Maria Novella in around 1300 while Dante was still in Florence. I would like to conclude this talk with briefly referring to this aspect. In the works, both Brunetto and Remigio bring together Aristotelian political philosophy and Christian theology, turning theological concepts such as charity into the basis of communal living. In his Rhetorica, Latini emphasizes the value of the art of rhetoric for the civic community by alluding to its power to teach love of God and neighbor among the citizens. And the quotation briefly is per recarli a divina conoscenza, cioè ad amare Dio e il prossimo. Remigio, on his part, adapts the theological concept of the order of charity, drawn from medieval exegesis on Song of Songs 2:4 to his political vision. While the order of charity traditionally consisted of love of God, self, and neighbor in that order, Remigio adds the community itself into the order and asserts that the love for the community should precede the individual love of self. And I quote here from his work, De Bono Comuni, for according to the order of charity, concerning which it is written in Song of Song 2:4, he ordered charity in me, the common good is indubitably to be preferred to the particular good, and the good of the multitude to the good of one single person. While readers such as Kantorowicz were alarmed by what they saw as the proto-fascist elements inherent in Remigio's valorization of the community, we should note that his call for love for the community was presented by him specifically as a way to counter the factional struggles that plagued Florence and the destructive egotism of its citizens. Dante's Purgatorio 13, therefore, follows along a similar path, establishing a deeply theological concept such as compassion as the foundation of the civic community and the means to counter the egotistic and strife-inducing envy. By that, Dante's Purgatorio, alongside other works, stand as a distant genealogical precursor of contemporary position, such as Nussbaum or proponents of the ethics, virtue ethics of care. So in conclusion, I've tried in this presentation to show how compassion functions as a defining virtue in Purgatorio 13, one which counters the egotistic envy. This virtue has for Dante particular communal value, serving as the foundation of his ideal community. His imaginative engagement with compassion in the canto not only establishes his Purgatorio as an important distant precursor of contemporary positions, but also offer, as I hope my discussion has shown, an especially powerful and moving account of compassion's ethical and social merits, one which still carries a punch today, 700 years later. Thank you.
So Erev Tov, good evening, everyone, wherever you may be. I'm delighted to take part in this conference, even from afar on Zoom, but I'm with you in spirit. And this final session is devoted to the question of Dante's afterlives. And of course, he has a phenomenal and fascinating history of many, many afterlives. So we'll have three speakers dealing with three different types of reception. And our first speaker is Shachar Livne, who completed her PhD in comparative literature a few months ago. We're very proud of her. Her thesis is titled De-authorizing Dante, Authorship and Readership in Dante and His 14th Century Poetic Heirs. She's currently a Lady Davis postdoctoral fellow at the English department of the Hebrew University, where she also teaches undergraduate seminars about Chaucer and his contemporaries. Her research interests are in medieval and early modern poetry and poetics, with a particular emphasis on Anglo-Italian literary and cultural interrelationships. And the new title of her talk is Looking Backwards, Moving Forward Between Dante, Statius, and Chaucer. Please, Shachar.
Yes, thank you, Ilana. Thank you, everyone. So in Dante's Purgatory, Dante and Virgil's encounter with the Roman poet Statius stands out as one of the text's most compelling scenes. The curious image of Dante reading Statius, reading Virgil, has remained a source of fascination and perplexement for nearly 700 years of readers. Among those readers was the father of English poetry, Geoffrey Chaucer, who clearly had it in mind when he composed his most elusive poem, The House of Fame, in which he presents himself as reading Dante, who reads Statius, reading Virgil. Before explaining how Chaucer reimagines this Dantean scene, I will first discuss Canti 21 and 22 of Purgatory, highlighting what Dante tacitly accomplishes through this poetic encounter between Virgil and Statius. How he is able to both signal his appreciation of their literary inheritance looking backwards to the classical world, and at the same time marking his progression forward to posterity, leaving behind these two masters. Purgatory 21 begins as Dante is following in the footsteps of his revered guide, Dietro al mio duca, when both Dante and Virgil suddenly hear a voice speaking to them from behind. Crucially, the text describes how both Virgil and Dante turn their gaze backwards to face the talking spirit, who turns out to be Statius. This Orphic movement of turning their gaze backwards is suggestive of the type of metapoetic encounter in which they're all about to engage. Through this momentous exchange, Dante indicates his complex relationship with his literary past. Today, I will argue that the emphasis placed on this peculiar directionality in which Dante looks backwards, yet nevertheless continues to move forward in order to complete his journey, while temporarily following in the footsteps of his master. So this directionality is foundational to the scene's metapoetic import. Indeed, through this episode, I argue, Dante not only expresses his reverence for Virgil and Statius, but he also indicates how his poetics looks back to them and beyond them at the same time, how he's not only their poetic heir, but a successor who will eclipse them and demand their flaws and errors. As we will see, this Dantean position will be taken up later by Chaucer in his adaptation of the scene and the poem House of Fame, composed around 1380. Returning to Purgatory 21, in their meeting with Statius, the identity of the later Roman poet is revealed in conjunction with an acknowledgement of Statius' debt to his poetic progenitor. In this moving scene, Statius humbly attributes both his poetic success and his spiritual transformation to Virgil. This meek presentation of Statius by Dante draws on the envoy to Statius' Thebaid, where he humbly implored his work to follow in Virgil's footsteps while continuing to honor his poetic epic from a distance. And this is the very famous line, Vive precor, so leave, I pray, and essay not the divine Aeneid, but ever follow her footsteps from afar in adoration. When Dante reads Statius' reverential reading of the Aeneid, he maintains this humbler characterization of Statius, when he too presents him as one who adoringly walks behind Virgil, while Virgil lights his way forward, as Statius announces, prima appreso Dio m'illuminasti, facesti come quei chi va di notte, che porta il lume dietro e se non giova, ma dopo sé fa le persone dotte. It is already here that Dante implicitly presents the eclipse of Virgil, who remains in the dark. However, Statius' poetics are insufficient as well. As Kevin Brownlee beautifully explains, when Dante shows through this scene, what Dante shows through this scene is that Virgil is damned, but his text is salvific. Statius is saved, but his text seems to be devoid of any Christian salvific value. These two poetic models are then partial, and a new direction for poetry, a new voice is urgently needed. And indeed, Dante solved this conundrum as a Christian poet who is to be saved and who composes a salvific epic poem. His poetics, therefore, shall surpass both of his predecessors' work. His transcendence beyond these two great poets is suggested through the multiple and varied mistakes both of them repeatedly make in this episode, whereas Dante remains silent. One of Statius' most flagrant failings here is being too enthusiastic a reader of Virgil. While both Dante and Statius are avid readers of his Latin epic, Statius cleaves to literary history, even going on to reenact scenes from the Aeneid. Dante thereby stages a warning about excessively engaging with the past. For example, when Statius discovers that he's standing in front of his revered Roman master, he falls to his predecessor's feet, longing to embrace him, only to quickly be reminded that both of them are mere empty shades. Embarrassed, Statius apologizes, admitting he forgot their emptiness. Io dismento nostra vanitate, trattando l'ombre come cosa salda. Here, Statius performs the emotional scene from Book 6 of the Aeneid, in which Aeneas, in his visit to the underworld, finally meets his dead father. And when the two try to embrace, Anchises painfully realizes that he's nothing more than a vain shade. But deep in a green veil was Father Anchises, and as he saw Aeneas coming towards him over the sward, he eagerly stretched forth both hands, while tears streaming from his eyes, a cry fell from his lips. Thrice there he threw his arms around his neck. Thrice the form, vainly clasped, fled from his hands. This reenactment of the Aeneid by Statius presents the younger Latin poet as an author who looks back to the past without learning from its mistakes, without persistently moving forward. It is by his extensive look backwards that Statius' failings are revealed. In contrast, here and elsewhere in the Commedia, Dante weaves allusions to events from earlier texts into his narrative, but he does so in a way that emphasizes reading both backwards and forwards. He urges readers to look backwards to his sources, but he also casts our readerly gaze forward by foreshadowing his ascent to the highest realm. This forward-backward movement is structured in opposition to how he portrays Statius, who is unable to both value his predecessor and cultivate a different way forward. Dante's progression forward, however, is introduced through the flagging of Virgil's insufficiencies when, in their exchange, Virgil admits to Statius that he was drawn forth from limbo in order to shepherd Dante in his quest. Yet the great poet quickly adds that he shall do so only as far as his schooling, his abilities may lead him. Mostreroli oltre quanto il potrà menar mia scuola. This marking of Virgil's own limits implies that Dante's Italian epic will ultimately transcend those of his predecessors. Throughout this meaningful encounter between the three poets, which stretches over 2 separate cantos, Dante remains uncharacteristically silent. And it is Virgil's and Statius' conversations that fills these lines. Other than briefly explaining his embarrassed smile to Statius, just after he was forbidden to speak at all by Virgil, who tacendo disse taci, so silently said, be silent, Dante remains mute as he continues to walk behind his interlocutors. This atypical silence makes more sense when observing how throughout this exchange, the 2 great Latin poets reveal their flaws. This is then another one of Dante's tactics aimed at subtly hinting at his subversive future. While he is silent, Virgil and Statius bear out their shortcomings and misunderstandings. First, it is Statius who mistakes Virgil and Dante's forms by assuming they are both simply ombre condemned to hell. Second, Statius confuses Virgil's form, as I've mentioned, when he tries to embrace him. And finally, Virgil too makes mistakes when he misinterprets Statius' sin and the reason he was sent to repent for his actions in Purgatory. The choice, therefore, to portray Dante's continued silence amidst all of these mistakes serves in further proving his supremacy. Unlike the other 2 poets, he does not allow himself to err, but retains a firm, steadfast position, somewhat removed from the emptiness or the vanitate of his predecessors. Although Dante highlights again in Canto 22 the fact that he's following in his master's footsteps, saying, senza alcun labore seguiva in su gli spiriti veloci, he will eventually leave behind both poets as his poem continues onwards to the highest of heights. As he does so, he continues occasionally to look backwards and reflecting on his poetic inheritance, yet he decisively moves forward. The question of poetic supremacy raised by Dante in Purgatory also serves as a central theme in Chaucer's House of Fame, deemed to be his most Dantean poem. Chaucer here comes to the fore as not only a poet who is influenced and informed by Dante's magnum opus, but as a keen supporter of his who too wishes to move beyond the ancient poets and their heritage and positions Dante as their literary heir who will revive their frozen and outdated tradition. Chaucer's narrator, Geoffrey, who in Dantean fashion shares a first name with his author, arrives at Lady Fame's isolated palace, which sits atop of a lofty rock that the narrator is compelled to climb. At the summit, in Fame's extensively decorated hall, Geoffrey will come to face the great poets of the Western tradition. But before he does, his description of his mountain ascent will ring as a clear allusion to Dante's and Virgil's ascent of Purgatory, and more specifically, to the lesson they receive about this mountain's meteorology in their encounter with Statius. So in Purgatory 21, Statius explains how Mount Purgatory is still governed by principles that hinder any alteration or disruption to its order. As Statius puts it, cosa non è che senza ordine senta la religione della montagna. In other words, causation in Purgatory is exclusively celestial. And this part of the mountain, so its upper slopes, which constitute Purgatory proper, is not subject to the mutable conditions of the lower slopes, known as ante Purgatorio. Statius goes on to stress how unchangeable these terraces are as they lie beyond the weather systems and are unaffected by these worldly concerns. And he says, non pioggia, non grando, non neve, non rugiada, non brina più succade che la scaletta di 3 gradi breve. And so on. And he goes on to say, no rain, no snow, no dew, so nothing alters this realm. The unwavering world that Dante establishes stands in contrast to the mountain in Chaucer's poem, which is made of is and not of stel, so of ice and not of steel, and forms a feeble foundation that is constantly under the control of changing conditions. This were a feeble fundament to building on a place he. This is a feeble foundation to build so lofty a place. Unforeseeable things like the sun's position affect the mountain's ice rock. And indeed, as Geoffrey climbs the high mountain, he notices the traces of names carved upon its icy face. He soon realizes that some of these names are indiscernible because the sun eroded what was written, and he can hardly make out more than a letter or two of the names of those who once were famous and celebrated. Då såg I all the halfe I gräva with famous folkets namn så fäll, but well on ethe kude I kno, any letters for to read, her names be. So unfamous was what se here fane, but men saying, what may ever last? So he says, there I saw engraved famous people's names, but scarce could I make out any letters to read their names by. So unfamous had their fame grown, and men say, what may ever last? Still, the narrator completes his ascent, and he then makes his way into the castle. Within Fame's abode, he sees different figures. Among them are Orpheus and other musicians who are playing their instruments, as well as Medea, Calypso, and different sorcerers who are performing their crafts. Passing by these different groups of famed figures, Geoffrey arrives at the feet of the monstrous Fame. Yet his attention is immediately drawn to the metal pillars he sees surrounding her throne, which are topped with sculptures of the classical world's greatest poets. Unlike the other personae that were actively recreating and performing their arts and crafts, these figures are lifeless and static. Next, Geoffrey identifies among these sculptures 6 poets: Virgil, Homer, Ovid, Lucan, Claudian, and Statius. This group of 6 poets links this episode with Dante's encounter with the Bella Scola in Inferno 4, as well as with the encounter with Statius in Purgatory, a scene which openly recalls those moments in limbo. To be sure, in Inferno 4, Dante names 5 actores whom he meets and who crown him and acknowledge him as one of their rank. Mi fecere della loro schiera, sic io fui sesto tra contacto seno. This very scene comes into focus in Purgatory 22 when, in the midst of their heated discussion, Virgil evokes these very verses in relation to Statius, referring to his wisdom tra cotanto seno. This lexical link establishes Statius as a part of the Bella Scola, perhaps even implying his superiority as the poet who will eventually repent his earthly sins. Thus, when Chaucer presents his own Bella Scola in the final book of the House of Fame, it is a direct allusion to both Inferno 4 and Purgatory 21 and 22. Interestingly, in accordance with Dante's description, the first to be identified by Geoffrey among the sculptors, who then assumes the superior position among the other poets, is Statius. And the iron pillar upon which he stands is said to be stained by Tigres' blood, so tiger's blood, which was the cause for the war at Thebes, according to his debate. Through this elaborate introduction, Statius received a focused attention that the others do not, affirming Dante's portrayal of his moral superiority in the Commedia. However, this group is placed under an ambiguous light when the narrator describes how the sculpture felt inconsequential, especially when comparing to the lively figure he passed by beforehand. And he says, "Though so ich stand on either side, stridun the doors with many a pillar of metal that should not full clear, but doch they ne'er of no riches." So though I saw on either side many pillars of metal which shone not very brightly and were of no great splendor or riches. Conspicuous in his absence here is Dante, who is referenced in other parts of Chaucer's poem, but who apparently has not been accepted to Chaucer's rendition of the Bella Scola. Given that these ancient poets seem to be left behind, insignificant and frozen in this iced palace, this fact would seem to be in Dante's benefit. By representing the ancients as static and lifeless, Chaucer endorses Dante's backward gaze. Like Dante, Chaucer too looks backwards, aware of the past inheritance of the actores, even ascribing Statius a privileged position as the saved poet, just as Dante singled him out. And like Dante, he implicitly turns his gaze back and forwards, past them, looking in anticipation towards poets such as Dante, with whom he indeed engages in a dialogue through allusions and lexical borrowings. Though he is not immortalized as a sculpture, Dante remains alive, consequential, and relevant. Even more broadly, Dante provided for Chaucer an example of how to design a complex meditation on literary history and its reception. He was the poetic model par excellence that displayed how a modern poet could both love and rival Virgil and Statius at the same time, how this kind of complicated engagement can yield intense and fascinating literary works. Thus, while Dante ostensibly is absent from this Bella Scola scene in the House of Fame, and while Chaucer's Sesta Compagnia is comprised of different authors, Dante's presence and indeed his superiority are markedly felt. Moreover, it is also clear that these episodes from the Commedia shaped Chaucer's own understanding and reception of not only these specific cantos from the Commedia, but his views on and beyond the classical tradition.
Thank you, Shachar. This was so lovely and so interesting. We're going to move on to the next speaker, Yaakov Massetti. Yaakov Massetti is senior lecturer in the comparative literature department at Bar Ilan University. He has published on the metaphysical poets, on Milton and humanist rhetoric. And this year he is he's leading an international research group on the history of the senses at the Israel Institute for Advanced Studies. So please, Yaakov.
Thank you very much, the organizers. This is a great privilege. I'm an early modernist, so I feel I'm, as usual, not in my context, but I should have gotten used to that kind of feeling by now. Anyways, here it goes. The parallel between Dante Alighieri and John Donne, the 17th century English metaphysical poet, is certainly not self-explanatory, but it provides an example of how the Dantean corpus inspired literates of different times. Now, in order to plunge into this parallel, we need to understand what a metaphysical poet actually is. And for that, we must go back to 1926, when T.S. Eliot, in the midst of the third of his Clarke lectures at Trinity College, Cambridge University, in front of an imposing pantheon of intellectuals such as Sir James Fraser, Alfred Whitehead, Bertrand Russell, G.E. Moore, and others, spelled out the theoretical assumption of his reading of John Donne's poetry against the background of the Italian Trecento in general and Dante in particular. There are essentially two ways in which poetry can add to human experience. One is by perceiving and recording accurately the world of both sense and feeling as given at any moment. The other by extending the frontiers of this world. Among the poets who have thus extended reality, I placed Dante first absolutely, and Baudelaire first in recent times. Now, Eliot's reading of Dante's love poetry, of his Vita Nova, of his Commedia, together with what he refers to as the metaphysical poet of Dante and his age, pointed to the product of men who felt and thought both clearly and beyond the ordinary frontiers of mind. Now, when Eliot used the expression metaphysical poet, which John Dryden and then Samuel Johnson had used in a disparaging way to criticize a group of poets of the 17th century, he actually meant to refer to those poets of all ages who, to use George Santayana's words, composed poetic texts capable of embodying a philosophical scheme in verse, investing all his talent and effort into the realization of, quote, his conception of man's part and place in the universe. With Lucretius and Goethe, Santayana saw Dante as an author of poetry capable of fixing and making more conscious and precise emotions and feelings in which most people participate in their own experience, and to draw within the orbit of feeling and sense what had existed only in thought. It creates a unity of feeling out of various parts, a unity of action, which epic or dramatic, whether epic or dramatic, a union, the simplest form of sound and sense, the pure lyric, and in various forms, the union of things hitherto unconnected in experience. Now, Dante Alighieri was therefore a poet whose work not only described the human psyche, but actually signaled a development therein, a poetry which sets down, quote, sets down within verse the unity of an experience which had previously only existed unconsciously. The poetic act addresses a physical reaction to the emotion, which is then a trigger for further embodied reactions, which then trigger further emotional/sensorial developments. An appropriately empowered poet could thus delineate the traits of a process leading to the modification of modification of an emotion by a thought, and then a thought by an emotion, in an operation of poetry that could eventually transmute into the immediacy of feeling. To use Santayana's words, the philosophical poet manages to evoke in simple words a moment of intuition, though feeling fleeting, which has a vision, a scope, a symbolic meaning, something about it that renders it deep and expressive. This conveyance of a momentary intensity can be expressed in all its fullness when the latter is compressed into that intense moment. And intuition, I'm sorry, why isn't this moving? 16. An intuition brought about by the philosopher's synthetic imagination, by virtue of which the whole world of man is gathered together, and as he summons all that has affinity to him in the universe. The height of poetry, Santayana concluded, is to speak the language of the gods. This connubium between thought and feeling within the sphere of poetry was possible as only one of three ways in which thought could invest itself and become poetry. The first was when a thought is expressed in poetic form in the language of thought. The second is when the poet provides a discursive exposition of an argument. The third is that which occurs when an idea or what is ordinarily apprehensible as an intellectual statement is translated in sensible form, so that the world of sense is actually enlarged. For each of these types of poetic performance, immense technical skills were required in order to make the discourse fly, for the ideas to be delineated clearly, and for the intellectual to soar up upon the wings of great emotional intensity. The culture which nurtured and formed Dante's mind was a civilization of this kind, and which was in some respects superior to that of the world of John Donne, so concluded Eliot. This superiority was characterized by a curious combination of highly trained intellects with feet very firmly on the ground, an intellectual superiority which expanded the reader's experience of the world and did so with a superior syntax and choice of words. You cannot, Eliot concluded with a rather dramatic statement, live on a higher plane and indulge yourself in verbiage. Rhetorical eloquence was at times not enough for the conveyance of an idea. A rationalized and analytical representation through the verbal sphere could only attain a limited understanding of the idea. What was necessary was an evocative representation, which would allow for a translation of thought into feeling and the conveyance of the emotional and sensitive aspects of an intellectual understanding. An illustration, one of the capital ideas, and this is Eliot, of Donne, the one which is perhaps his peculiar gift to humanity, is that of the union, the fusion and identification of souls in sexual love. To state it, to deposit it nomically, or to analyze it, is nothing. To express it, to evoke it, is everything. It is hardly a thought at all. The characteristic type of poetry I'm trying to define is that it elevates sense for a moment to regions ordinarily attainable only by abstract thought, or on the other hand, clothes the abstract for a moment with the painful delight of flesh. Dante Alighieri too, like Donne, always finds the sensuous equivalent, I'm quoting here from Eliot, finds the sensuous equivalent, the physical embodiment for the realization of the most tenuous and refined intensity of experience. This poetic power was, though, a characteristic not only of Dante Alighieri, but was shared by a number of his contemporaries, such as Guido Cavalcanti, to whom Dante dedicates his Vita Nova, Guido Gunizelli, Cino da Pistoia, and others. But what was, we should at this point inquire, the relationship between, to use Eliot's words again, the Trecento in Italy and the 17th century in England? Meaning, what are you talking about? The new critical or quasi-formalist approach of Eliot is certainly viable and legitimate, and as he states that the, quote, study of derivation and influence is apt to mislead us, for it is, quote, more often the form that passes on than the spirit. For as he explained in another of his Clark lectures, when dealing with different schools or groups of poetry spread out across time, one must address resemblances, quote, which are neither, purely natural and unconscious, nor purely conscious and deliberate. And yet a number of scholars in the 20th century have indeed tried to employ analysis and division, namely more empirical methods of documented connections in order to explain or address the similarities between Donne and Dante. In 1924, Evelyn Simpson wrote in her A Study of the Prose Works of John Donne that the English poet had traveled in France, Spain, and Italy, the Grand Tour, and knew something of the language and literature of all these countries, making him one of the few Jacobean writers who read Dante in the original, commenting at length on a passage of the Inferno in a letter written probably to Sir Henry Wotton, one of his best friends. Donne had referred to Dante again in Satire 4, as you can see on your screens, oops, not anymore, pointing to the wholesome solitariness of his home and to a moment in which his precious soul plunged into a trance, like his who dreamt he saw hell did advance itself o'er me. Having evidently studied him, namely Dante, early in his life, Donne was by no means an uncritical reader. In his letter to Henry Wotton, Donne, in fact, expressed his anger for Pope Celestine's fifth presence in hell. Vidi e conobbi l'ombra di colui che fece per viltà lo gran rifiuto. And referred to, as you can see on the second line from the top, Dante the Italian, a man pert, cheeky, pert, namely cheeky, enough to be beloved and too much to be believed. In 1925, 4 years before Eliot's lectures at Cambridge, Mario Prats published a book titled Secentismo e Marinismo in Inghilterra, John Donne e Richard Crashaw, where he pointed out with an erudite nonchalance typical of Mario Prats that there are interesting similarities between Donne's poem The Ecstasy and Guido Guinizelli's Al cor gentil ripara sempre amore, within lines 28 and 29. With an encyclopedic knowledge of the poetry of the 16th and 17th centuries in 4 languages, Prats had also stated with certainty that Donne knew the Divine Comedy and that he had used its structure and general idea in order to write his Ignatius, his Conclave, a polemical and satirical work in which Donne places Ignatius of Loyola in hell of all places. In the twinkling of an eye, I saw all the rooms in hell open to my sight, and by the benefit of certain spectacles, I know not of what making, but I think of the fame by which Gregory the Great and Bede did discern so distinctly the souls of their friends when they were discharged from their bodies, and sometimes the souls of such men as they knew not by sight, and of some that were never in the world, and yet they could distinguish them flying into heaven. As for the suburbs of hell, yeah, I mean both limbo and purgatory, I must confess I passed them over so negligently that I saw them not. I was hungrily carried to find new places never discovered before. So the parallel between Dante and Donne is not simply a direct consequence of formalist or even new critical readings, but can and has been documented. Despite the cultural and temporal distance between the two, both Donne and Dante aimed and indeed managed to convey in what Donne would have called the potent receivers of their verses, an alloy of feeling and thought, or to use Eliot's blatantly Christian expression, the word made flesh. The union of the souls in Donne's The Ecstasy and the Dantean idea of a sinful union of souls in Canto 5 of Inferno will be my next focus. John Donne's ecstatic poetic vision in The Ecstasy, of course, is one which the speaker works up to with a series of exercises in thought and feeling. The two lovers initially look for the physical means to unite and refine their duality into a perfect moment of union. Their hands firmly cemented, their eyes locked, an optic effect through which the reflection of each is found in the eyes of the other, a moment of propagation, of visual and mutual representation and reproduction. Now, dissatisfied by the extent of this physical union, Donne's speaker describes a moment of ecstatic detachment of the souls from those insufficient bodies, and a dialogue of souls hung twixt her and me. If any, I hope you can see this. Yeah, you can see the whole thing. If any so by love refined that he soul's language understood, and by good love were grown all mind, within convenient distance stood, he, though he knew not which soul spake, because both meant, both spake the same, might thence a new concoction take, and part far purer than he came. This ecstasy doth unperplex, we said, and tell us what we love. We see by this it was not sex. We saw not what did move. This is Donne's Dantean moment, the dialogue of souls, Yes, but also the interaction of a reader, pensa, lector, with the incomprehensible and ineffable moment of spiritual dialectics, in which meaning is conveyed not through physical signs, but through irrepresentable or ineffable signs. In order to understand the semantics of souls, or the soul's language, Donne posits that the reader of this dialogue must be by love refined, uplifted above the limitations of the body and grown all mind. Standing at a convenient distance, this reader not only perceives the dialogue and understands the soul's mutual conveyances, but is literally refined into a new concoction of body and soul, and parts far purer than he came. It is love that refines the cognition and the reading skills of Donne's spiritual reader, allowing her to understand how soul, body, and the senses are the critical components of what he calls further on in that same poem, that subtle knot that makes us man. Please work, thank you. What Donne is proposing here is, in other words, a different model of love poetry, a different perception of human physicality, a different conception of reading. Against the background of the metaphysics and spiritualism of Petrarchan poetry, Donne's verses rebel against what he considers, I think, an insufficient model of love. Donne was most probably Italian. He either writes of food or sex. He presents there an insufficient model of love, an imperfect understanding of the body and its significance, and an insufficient idea of reading. Over-reading the body's importance entails, therefore, a misunderstanding of what it is that motivates love. The ecstatic moment scatters all traces of perplexity and teaches Donne's reader that love is first an ineffable moment of interanimation, and only then descends, as you can see in line 65 and on, descends to affections and to faculties that sense may reach and apprehend. Love's mysteries, concludes the speaker, in souls do grow, but yet the body is his book, so that upon reverting to a sexual expression of the ineffable union of the souls, the reader will see small change when we are to bodies gone, namely having sex. The Dantesque approach to this matter of physical versus spiritual love as an allegory of reading and cognitive refinement can be found, I think, again, in Canto 5 of Inferno. Paolo and Francesca is there not an element of refinement, but one which plunges the two into the depths of damnation. This is a tale of perdition and expiation. The lover's skills as readers, quoters, interpreters of the courtly tradition are debated by Dante as the speaker places amor as the canto's focus. In this way, Dante embroiders a delicate fabric of stil novo and courtly references, and then tears it asunder with a knife of reality. The common interpretation of this moment in Dante's voyage through the underworld is as follows: falling in love according to the rules and roles of courtly love leads the lovers directly to death. Amor ch'al cor gentile ratto s'apprende prese costui della bella persona che mi fu tolta, e il modo ancor m'offende. Amor ch'annullo amato, amar perdona mi prese del costui piacer sì forte, che, come vedi, ancor non m'abbandona. Amor condusse noi ad una morte. Love, which is quickly kindled in a gentle heart, seized this one for the fair form that was taken from me, and the way of it afflicts me still. Love, which absolves no loved from loving, seized me so strongly with delight in him, that, as you see, it does not leave me then, even now. Love brought us to death. These lines are probably the most heavily glossed in the canto and in the Commedia. Interpreters of all eras have been compelled to explore all possible associations and to construct and deconstruct alliances within this short text. Different interpretations proffer very different outlooks on love and desire, ranging from very positive and from the very positive, implying even the existence of a corner of paradise and hell, to the highly negative, emphasizing the utter defeat of the two lovers. It would appear, though, that Dante is not attaching any incontrovertible reading to this complex text, but is rather inviting his readers to try at first hand the pleasures and troubles of interpretation and to experience the sophistication of the discourse of love. Like Paolo and Francesca, Dante's reader is tempted by the physicality of a story of courtly love, allured to kiss and read no more, and thus to cave in to the allurement of the physical sphere. As Mary Patton Ramsay wrote, "La dame provençale n'est nullement angélisée, on la craint pas, on la désire." Quite categorical. In Dante's representation of the encounter of the pilgrim with the two entangled, damned souls of Paolo and Francesca, the act of reading, that performed by the two lovers and that performed by the reader engaging this section of the Commedia, is a dangerous one that can lead straight to perdition. The dialogue of souls, which to Donne could refine the cognitive skills of a reader who has a priori grown all mind and is thus presented as one who is empowered to avoid the allurement of the bodily sphere. The same dialogue of souls is to Dante a token of a moment of défaillance, the consequence of hermeneutic slippage, whereby the two loving readers identify their actions with those of the text read. As Elena Lombardi has compellingly argued, when the kiss is displayed with immediacy in language, it tears the context asunder, creating a space of violent subversion of the spiritual, literary, and social order. The kiss of Inferno 5, paralleled by the interanimation of Donne's souls, is the moment of the actual fusion of the lovers. While their bodies become one in the connection of the lips, Francesca's persona and Paolo's piacere are truly mutated into a new person of desire. Donne's reader of united souls is refined, or so we hope, or so I think he hopes, by the interanimating love of those souls, and understands how the bodily and the spiritual must entangle for there to be a moment of understanding. Dante's reader of the two souls of Paolo and Francesca clinging together as a punishment for their uncontrolled desire and embodied hermeneutics is tempted into experiencing an ecstatic loss of consciousness, like Dante's pilgrim who, quote, for pity swooned as if in death and falls down, quote, as a dead body falls. Donne's united souls elicit an act of reading that is refined, purified beyond the limitations of the mind-body dichotomy, empowering the reader to see that it is not sex that which motivates love, even though cynically we are drawn to conclude that really the speaker is actually only aiming for that. Paolo and Francesca's kissing, the cessation of reading, and the physical expression of their infatuation actually entails what Mark Ansler has called an act of, quote, affective reading, enacting a form of textuality in which the kissing lips may erase and assimilate the words, images that the reading lips are scanning. The refining union of souls is that of Dante, the refining union of souls is that of Dante the pilgrim with Beatrice in Paradiso, where the non-kiss is a moment of union through the eyes. Beatrice tutta nell'eterne rote fissa con gli occhi stava, e io in lei le luci fissi di là su rimote, nel suo aspetto tal dentro mi fei, qual si fe glauco nel gustar dell'erba, che il fe consorto in mar degli altri dei. Beatrice, who was standing with her eyes all fixed upon the eternal wheels, and I fixed mine on her, withdrawn from there above, gazing upon her, I became within me such as Glaucus became on tasting the grass that made him sea fellow of the other gods. The kiss of the eyes between Dante and Beatrice suggests, unlike the Donnian dialogue of one, a remapping, a dislocation the bodily loci of exchange between lovers in medieval poetry and of courtly love, which nonetheless retains both the pleasure and the transformative powers of the kiss of the mouth. Thank you very much.
Thank you. This is wonderful. Of course, it reminds me of the Song of Songs and its different interpretations. Let's move to our final speaker. Aminadav Dickman is a professor of Hebrew and Comparative Literature at the Hebrew University. Dickman is a fellow of the Academy of Hebrew Language and a laureate of the Prime Minister's Prize and the Chernyakhovsky Prize for Translation. He's the author of the Psalms in Russian poetry, and more recently, Shurot al Shurot, Masot Mechkarim Reshimot. He's a renowned translator, primarily of poetry. I'll mention but a few of his most recent translations. הצלב והוורד, שירה לטינית מימי הביניים, רסיסים יווניים, מבחר, just published recently. Ami, please.
You have to unmute.
Now? Okay, great. So thanks for the presentation and the invitation. Ladies and gentlemen, in today's lecture, I would like to survey several Hebrew works that are linked directly or obliquely, in reality or in imagination, to Dante's Commedia and Vita Nuova. Some of these texts have already been explored from this perspective by many scholars in the past. I hope to add something to the research towards the end of this communication. Let us begin by saying that Jewish literature has its own traditional vision of heaven and hell. Among the many evil midrashim, I hear a terrible echo. Something can be done about that? No, okay. Among the many early medieval midrashim, one finds several small tractates that deal with both heaven and hell. Among those, mention should be made of the tractate of hell, Masechet Gehinom, out of which I quote but one little passage to offer you a taste of the rest. Said Rabbi Joshua ben Levi, as I was walking the road one day, I met the prophet Elijah, blessed be his memory, who said to me, would you like me to bring you to the gates of hell? I replied, yes. He then showed me people hung by their noses, other by their hands, other by their arms, people hung by their tongues, people hung by their legs, women hung by their breasts, people hung by their eyes, people fed their own flesh, people fed burning coals, people seated and eaten alive by worms, and so it goes on in a most unpleasant way. These tractates, together with the posterior literature, were amply elaborated on within the vast framework of Kabbalistic literature, which greatly widened and deepened the vision of hell with vivid descriptions of Satan, Samael, and of Lilith, accompanied by a multitude of them demons bearing the most fantastic names. As this is very far from my areas of expertise, I only limit myself to mentioning this fact. The first Hebrew author who drew the attention of many scholars, old and recent, in connection to Dante, was, of course, Emmanuel of Rome, Emmanuel Haromi, Manuel di Roma, or Manuelo Giudaio, as he is known in Italian. Manuel was a poet, a linguist, and a Bible commentator who was born in Rome in 1261 and died in Fermo, probably in the year 1328. In the history of Hebrew literature, he is chiefly known for his large satirical work, Machberot Immanuel's books, a series of 28 such books written in rhymed prose and interlaced with pieces of poetry. The concluding 28th book is entitled Machberet Tofet Va'eden, the Book of Hell and Paradise. At the beginning of the book, Emmanuel tells his reader that having reached the age of 60, he began fearing death and summoned the prophet Daniel to show him what might be in store for him should he reach hell or paradise. Daniel then leads him on, and Emmanuel tours the realms of hell first. Let me read to you one passage in the excellent translation of Hermann Golland's, published in London exactly 100 years ago. I quote, "There did we see a land of gloom, a great funeral pyre, its claim, its sparks of fire burning with the mighty flame. The stake was of fire and wood without end, nor day nor night its force did spend. Then the man Daniel said, this is the pile that gleams, burning as brimstone in the streams, reserved for souls full of rebellion's dreams. Would thou know why the wicked are here and what their name? Study closely the name on their forehead, inscribed with their shame." Emmanuel then lists an extremely long list of biblical villains, among them Esau, the people of Sodom and Gomorrah, Amalek, the Pharaoh, Haman, and a multitude of others. And paired with those, Nebuchadnezzar, Titus, Aristotle, Galenus, Al-Farabi, Hippocrates, and finally Avicenna. I wish to draw your attention to the title Golland's gave his rendering, Hell and Paradise, in imitation of Dante's Inferno and Paradiso, from the Hebrew of Emmanuel ben Solomon Romi, Dante's contemporary. For my subject today, this title is almost enough. Whether the books of Emmanuel are, in truth, an imitation of Dante or not, is almost beside the point. What matters is that they were thought of by generations of readers and scholars as exactly that. Modern readers, it should be noted, reject almost unanimously any serious comparison between Dante and Emmanuel. At best, they would agree, like our colleague Professor David Fischerov, that the enormous gap between Dante and Emmanuel depends on the latter's interest in verbal activity rather than in history or theology. Or like Asher Sela, who wrote an extensive article about Dante in Jewish Italian literature, that inasmuch as Emmanuel competes with the literary model of Dante, it is only with the aim of creating something entirely different by using an exclusively Jewish frame of reference. The next author we should visit is the poet Moses D'Arietti, 1388, circa 1460, author of the monumental poem Mikdash Me'at, the Little Temple, begun in 1416 and never finished. This extremely long poem is a rhymed encyclopedia of Jewish and general knowledge. The general structure of Mikdash Me'at is meant to reproduce on paper the temple in Jerusalem, leading its reader from the entrance hall to the hall and finally to the Holy of Holies. It seems Rietti never brought this temple in verse to its completion. The second part is truncated and the third part is missing altogether. Alessandro Guetta summarized Mikdash Me'at in the following words, I quote, "The poem contains materials of narrative, philosophical, theological, allegorical, historical, and juridical nature, filled out with prayers to God or his emanations." For his ambitious endeavor, Rieti adopted a poetic form hitherto unknown to all Hebrew poets in Italy who were present there as of the 9th century, hendecasyllabic tercets with an interlocking rhyme scheme, that is to say, Dante's terza rima. Much like his illustrious predecessor, Yehuda al-Kharisi, in the 12th century, who acknowledged his artistic debt to the great Arabic poet al-Hariri, Rieti mentions the Commedia as his source of inspiration. This is an interesting passage, which I will quote in Raymond Scheinley's brilliant English rendition. I quote, "I whet my intellect and brace myself to make a book out of the sciences established by the ancients and arranged to be their monument after death. As I now consecrate my senses 5 and purify my thoughts as if with lye, to build a house among the holy for my fame. For I have seen among the Christian folk a book whose themes are all imagination. In Hebrew, kol nosav dimyoniot, and I have made a convent with its style. Va'echreta limlitzato brit." The book is naturally Dante's Commedia. The following stanza is also interesting, and I quote, "Had their tongue suffered exile as mine by God's decree, their silly fantasies never could have been composed in verse." What Rieti means to say is that unlike Hebrew, which only expresses true knowledge attained through the intellect, Dante's Italian expresses uncertain knowledge conveyed by imagination. And he claims to Rieti, not to me. Rieti, as he stated quite openly, adopts the form only, not any of the content. As is Emmanuel's case, the actual affinity of Rieti to Dante is of almost secondary importance. What matters is that every mention of Rieti in literature brings about Dante's name inevitably. Let us continue. The next pair of authors that should be mentioned here are Rabbi Moshe Zakut, circa 1620 to 1698, and Yaakov Olmo, circa 1690 to 1757. Zakut, traditionally known by his acronym Remez, that is to say, hint of a secret, was born into a Marano family in Amsterdam, studied under one of the greatest rabbis there, continued his Talmudic studies in Poland, and finally settled in Venice as a rabbi there. He was a prolific writer, a poet, a rabbi, and a Kabbalist. His play Tofte Aruch, Hell Prepared, was first published in Venice in 1715. Considered by some the first popular drama in Hebrew, Hell Prepared consists of 185 five-line stanzas telling the story of an anonymous rich dead man who is being shown the horrors of hell by a demon who leads his soul through its various circles. The learned ophthalmologist David Aryeh Friedman, who produced a modern edition of the play 99 years ago in Berlin, rightly called it the first Hebrew mystery play. A typical Baroque figure, Zakut filled his lines with paronomasia and homonyms, or Hebrew gongorisms, as Professor Dvorah Bregman called those. In this element, it is in this element, especially present in the demon's long monologues in the second act of the play, that I see something that may be compared, however faintly, with the Dantesque principle of contrapasso. Let me try and exemplify this to the best of my ability. The 94th stanza reads thus, I quote in Hebrew, because the sound is of importance. Emesh penei dal bischi olalta, yitzrach ka'olal lach, ve'at bazemer, hayom zemoratach, kezimrat zemer tisrach, וזה לך מעלל עוללת, זמרת זמורתך אשר עוללת. Literally translated, this means more or less, yesterday you trampled the face of the poor man in the mud. He was crying like a baby and you were singing. Today, all that is left of you lays on the ground like a cut branch, stinking like a beast's carcass. And this is all the song of the glory you have accomplished. Zakut here plays with the various semantic meanings of the roots z, m, r, and l, l. The transformation of the dead man's fate is especially present in the play with the root z, m, r. That which was sung, zemer, of cruel victory, became a cut branch, stinking like a beast's carcass, both zemer. It is quite futile to compare Zakut's hell prepared with the Commedia seriously. His vivid description of the torments of hell are entirely based on the aforementioned Midrashim and not on Dante, and on select passages from the Book of Splendor, the Zohar. The same is true of almost Paradise Prepared, the second batch of Midrashim that deals with paradise. However, from the perspective of that which interests me here, this is again of little importance. What matters, in my mind, is that Dante's work is ever present in the background. Whenever Zakut's plays refer to, mention of the Commedia is inevitable. Many called Moshe Zakut the Hebrew Dante, wrote Friedman in the preface to his edition. The same circles gave the same appellation to Emmanuel of Rome and to Darieti. But in doing so, the givers never thought of any artistic or literary comparison. For them, the main thing was the Dantesque subject matter common to all three poets, hell and the torments of men in hell. I think this assertion is correct and sums up the matter aptly. Had my theme been limited to the history of Jewish writing in Italy, both in Hebrew and Italian, several other authors could have been mentioned, but this is not my theme. I therefore move along. The poets of the so-called Hebrew Renaissance at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th centuries seem to have passed Dante's name almost in silence. When one of the two leading poets of the generation, Shaul Chernyakhovsky, asked in one of his later poems to adorn his desk with statuettes of those great poets, thinkers, and ancient gods that inspired him, he named Homer, Goethe, and Shakespeare, but not Dante. One of the younger figures of that generation, a minor poet, as he himself readily admitted, but a brilliant translator and a giant revolutionary in matters linguistic and political, according to some, Zev Vladimir Jabotinsky, produced the first incomplete but highly influential translation of several cantos from the Inferno into Sephardic Hebrew, which he himself helped to shape and stabilize. The next generation, that of Hebrew modernism, seems to continue ignoring Dante with two major exceptions. The poetess Leah Goldberg, who alongside Avraham Shlonsky and Natan Alterman formed the Holy Trinity of Israeli modernism, spent much time studying Dante, teaching the Commedia at the Hebrew University, and writing an extensive introduction to it. Among Goldberg's suppressed, unpublished poems, put out not long ago by our colleague, Professor Gideon Tikotsky, one finds two pieces directly related to Dante. A cycle of 3 poems under the title, As I Was Reading Dante, and a relatively long nameless poem whose opening lines read, I quote, "Should the Roman poet come and take my hand and lead me to the Inferno, showing me how the world atones for its sins." The subject matter of this poem was ever dear to Goldberg's heart, the cold, stupid crowd that remains indifferent to the poet's visions. Thus, she says in the first stanza, "Even if I'm led through the Inferno by Virgil, as Dante was," and now I quote, "when I return home, you will stare at me with cold, disenchanted eye, conceive bold commentaries, and say, this is poetry, nothing but poetry." The 3-poem cycle rests entirely on the Paula and Francesco episode in Canto 5 of the Inferno. Here is a translation of the second poem, which bears the epigraph, "E caddi come morto corpo cadde." And I fell as falls a dead corpse, she writes in Hebrew. In my pity, my own soul is an inferno, which stupidly, naively, I built for myself with my own hands. One of the most brilliant, now I would like to pass to another text, particularly dear to my heart. One of the most brilliant musical and bitterly humorous poets of Hebrew modernism was one who never set foot in Palestine. This was the poet Chaim Lenski, the last Hebrew poet in Soviet Russia. In the 1920s, he led a group of young poets who insisted to keep on writing in Hebrew in spite of the state ban on that language. Almost all of the members of this cycle, known as the Leningrad Group, were arrested during the 1930s. Lenski himself was arrested twice. First in 1934, after Kirov's murder, for a stretch of 5 years, and then again in 1941 with the advent of Operation Barbarossa. He perished in a labor camp in Siberia for as much as we know in 1943. Lenski's Siberian poems contain some of the most heroic and moving pieces of his poetic legacy. One such poem is Midat Hadin Tzanfa Otam Bachofen. The stern law clenched them in its fist. This 6-stanza piece is written in terza rima, which appears only this once in Lenski's entire corpus. It is intertextually linked both to the Inferno and to Alexander Pushkin's well-known poem of 1827, In the Depths of Siberian Mines, В глубине сибирских руд. Here is a crude translation of 4 of its 5 stanzas. The stern law clenched them in its fist, stuck a hoe in the palms of the children of science, and with bent backs, naked to their waists, under the skies of Siberia, in its soil, they dug Euclid's dimension, meter by meter, till they struck mammoth bones. But their hoe did not flinch of the limestone layers, as much as their spoon shakes when they draw some bone or a little fat from their daily ration broth, a daily ration of broth. And I also am part of this mob. Shaking a drop of sweat from my upper lip, I hiss, a flock of human sheep. Idiocy, idiocy, no backbone, none but underbelly. The whip itself despises them. Over them one can only wail, may God have mercy. Lenski often described the camp as an inferno, wrote Professor Dan Miron, commenting on this poem. It is not by chance that this poem was cast in terzinas, a clear reference to Dante's Inferno. The speaker in this poem regards the other prisoners with utmost contempt. He does say that he is one of them and shares their fate, but all he finds in them is idiocy, the idiocy of reptiles. They lack even distorted pain. The whip itself scorns them. He, on the other hand, remains a wholesome person, if only because he can appreciate the Siberian sky, feel some compassion for the depth of its soil and the very prehistoric beasts in them, end quote. Let me finally pass to our own contemporary Israeli literature. One of Israel's leading poets, the greatest Israeli living poet, according to some, is Meir Wieseltier, born in 1941 in Moscow. It is generally acknowledged that his poetry has the widest intertextual spread among Israeli poets. Wieseltier has written 2 poems that directly relate to Dante. The first is a short poem entitled La Vita Nuova, which appeared in his 1976 collection, Something Optimistic, The Making of Poems. It begins with this statement, I quote, "It took me years to understand Dante, apropos Beatrice," and goes on to assert that there is an advantage in late understanding, for, I quote, "This set of signs is no longer a deceptive hint, a bud of hedonistic wisdom, a trident of sweet, wise lies." In his pivotal collection of 1981, Exit into the Sea, there is another Dantesque poem that requires no special commentary, which I would like to quote in full. It bears the title Commedia et Sit, Wooden Comedy, I quote. "At an almost equal distance between his day of death and his day of birth, a man enters a wood full of gardening workers. Of the trees around, some will be cut, some trimmed. Branches get separated from their trunk without a sigh. A trimmed tree will be vested in a new form, inadvertently. After a while, by conditional growth, it may touch an adjacent wall, maybe a fence, if at all, of another wall." Moving on, I now come to a younger author, the novelist, translator, and poet Alon Altaras, born 1960. Altaras is known for his novels and translations from Italian, notably Ferrante's novels, began his career as a poet. Between 1982 and 1996, he published 4 slim poetry collections. the third of which is entirely based on the Vita Nuova and the Commedia. Almost each poem in this book contains a reference to or a paraphrase of lines and passages from Dante. Contrary to the custom of providing an English translation of the book's title, the name is translated into Italian, Il Foco che affina. The book contains 30 poems, mostly dedicated to Altaraz's deceased mother and to an unnamed beloved feminine figure. I shall only quote one short poem that I think effectively represents the entire collection. I quote, "Unlike that Greek who broke his mother's heart with sorrow, and I'm like you who went to exile from your beloved city, through reading, scrutiny, and study, I myself descend to the chamber of death. And as I love you when you were mortal body, so I shall love you when you become a skeleton." The last two lines, printed between quotation marks, are a paraphrase of lines 88 to 90 in the second canto of the Purgatorio, where they are uttered by the composer Casella, who says, "Così com'io t'amai nel mortal corpo, così t'amo sciolta." To conclude this survey of references to Dante in Hebrew poetry, mention should be made of a recently published book, The Rake, Hamagrefa, by Sharon Haas, born 1966. Haas, who won several prestigious awards, holds a degree in classics, and is held to be an erudite poetess whose poems are filled with intricate reminiscences of ancient and modern literature. The Rake contains one poem that deals specifically with Dante, a meditation following a long reading of the Commedia. It is too long to be quoted in full, so I only quote the opening lines. "After more than 15 years of reading the Divine Comedy, I come closer to Beatrice, to the strange secret of her figure. How do you produce mastery adjacent to another mastery?" I feel my lecture today will be grossly incomplete should I not mention one more recent work, the play Eros and Melancholy, written by our colleague, Professor Yoav Rinon. Rinon's poetical translation of the entire Inferno saw the light of day in 2014. In the first act of part one of his new play, at a crucial point of the plot, which I will not divulge here, the entire scene of Paolo and Francesca is performed both in the Italian original and in his own translation. Dante, as I've tried to show, has a firm presence in Hebrew letters. Certainly, this presence is limited in scope when compared to larger literatures. We don't have any dead souls in Hebrew, but to my mind, it is no less interesting. I thank you for your kind attention.
Toda, Ami. It's really quite amazing. We could have had a whole conference just on the afterlives of Dante in Hebrew literature.
I think we've reached the end, and it's been 3 long days. And I want to use this opportunity of a closing discussion just to first thank all of you, really, all the speakers, for joining us and for your stimulating contributions in the past 3 days. Now, I know that for many of you, it has been a long Dante here. And as Roberto said yesterday, there were a lot of conferences on Dante. And this is coming right at the very end of the year. So I know that Justin was tired of Dante conferences. He didn't either. So we really appreciate that you made the effort and time to join us online. And we really hope to have you all here with us in the very near future to continue our discussions of Dante. And I would like, I know it's late and I will 5 minutes to try to conclude our discussion and bring up some of the main points that I thought came that were central to our discussions in the past 3 days. And as I said in the beginning, the aim of a conference was to bring together Dante Studies with its philological roots on the one hand, and then the recent turn to a world literature with its global aspirations, and to think about the meaning of Dante Studies in an age of globalization. So several central themes, I think, came up in our discussions in the past 3 days. And this is my take. So if anyone has something else to say, maybe we can talk about it afterwards privately. Anyway, so one thing that came up is the nature of Dante's universalism or globalism. I think this was a very interesting and important point that came up in all the lectures, especially in the first day, the first 4 lectures. And Elisa made a very interesting claim about Dante's universalism as, and I'm quoting her term, universalistic Eurocentrism, right? That was the idea that came up. And in this sense, Dante's universalism is Eurocentric in her view. And this, I think, tied in very well with Kevin's paper, which talked about the Christian aspect element of Dante's universalism. And in this sense, this is Christian universalism. And I think that these views were modified in really interesting ways by Roberta's analysis of Dante and the Book of Islam. And she made a very interesting point that Dante's universalism, we should think about it as modern, in the sense that there is in Dante an openness to difference and otherness that we tend to associate with modernity. And I hope that I summarize your take about it faithfully, Roberta. So these were like two I think, interesting positions on the question of Dante universalism. And the question is closely tied to Dante's attitude to others. And what came up in the first day is the attitude to Jews in following Barbero's talk, and to Muslims in Roberta's talk. And these are all questions that can be further thought about. Now, the question of universalism is related to the metaphor of borders and border crossing and navigation that was central to several of the papers. Chiara spoke about it, Justin spoke about it, Christina as well, and others. And Justin also asked us to historicize this interest, right? And to look at borders and border crossing within the Commedia. And the question of border crossing brings us to the way that Dante's own masterpiece, the Commedia, crosses borders, right? In the sense of linguistic and temporal borders and appropriated in new context. And there were a lot of excellent papers on this aspect. And I go back to Chiara's paper on that. Sefi spoke about the notion of exile in Michelangelo, Shachar today in Chaucer, and Yoav in the idea of Fortuna, Yaakov Rinon, of course, Ami's paper. I mean, there were a lot of discussions about this issue and the appropriation of Dante and how the Commedia crosses borders. And in Christina's paper, she reflected on the uses of Dante in contemporary African art and popular imagination. And she pointed to the need to be attuned to Dante's own meanings when we appropriate the text, right? And this remark, I think, goes to the heart of the tension between philology and world literature. And while philology wishes to historicize and contextualize as much as possible, world with the contemporary perspective, with the way with the receiving culture, with the receiving text, rather than with the original one. And the proper balance between the two is the main challenge, is the issue. And I think a lot of us grapple with it. And how do you bring together the contextualization of philology and the contemporary interest? And this is something I grapple in my paper and others too. And I think that this tension was also the center of Professor Kablitz's discussion, very interesting discussion and critique of Auerbach. And for Kablitz, and correct me if I'm wrong, you see Auerbach modernization of Dante as a distortion of the Commedia and its medieval dimensions, right? And in this it's especially striking because Auerbach, the epitome of the philologist, is, in your view, ahistorical in a way, right? In his reading of the Commedia, and I thought this was a fascinating take. And this also bring up the question of Dante as medieval or modern, something that is lurking in the background in many of the talks. And finally, there is the question of Dante's continuing relevance for a current moment, our contemporary world, a global predicament, and there were very interesting discussion of this issue. And today, Professor Vettori spoke about Dante's transgressiveness as something that is of interest to contemporary predicament. Yeah, and there was also Chiara's interesting point regarding our age as the age of purgatory, rather than the 20th century was the age of the Inferno, Romanticism was the age of the Inferno, and our age maybe is the age of purgatory. And since the purgatory is the realm of hope, I think it's a good way to end with our age as the age of hope. And on this note, I will conclude. And thank you again, everyone, for your wonderful contribution and